This is a two-header, I think they believe, is how they represent it. I will provide some historical background, and then Dr. Ian Brooks has very kindly said that he will cover the technical side of the survey work that's been going on near Dolgellau. So I'm sure all your questions will be for him. So moving on. The reason that the Dolgellau woolen industry has been so neglected is that there's very little left. And this is an absolute tragedy for local people and for everybody else, because of course now it's really difficult to reconstruct what was there. However, what you do have are in the place names around. You have Caidentir, which would be Tenterfield in English. You have Pandy, the Fulham Mill, and you also have Caestabal. And Caestabal is not what you'd expect it to be, which is stable. It's staple. It's where the wool was collected by the monks of Camarabi and put in a ship to go down the Moldach. So you do have these echoes of the woolen industry and its importance in Dolgellau. And this is a painting by David Cox in 1849 of the remains of Camarabi. And it's really important to stress that they were the catalyst for bringing large-scale sheep raising to Meirionnydd. The Welsh, the Celts, were very keen on their cattle, and cattle was their wealth. But the monks saw the future in sheep, and they did bring a lot of sheep to the local area. So they were founded in 1198. Gerard Cymro, the well-known traveller around Wales, noted that Meirionnydd had a lot of sheep, so they must have bought a lot by then. And then in 1209, Llywelyn Fawr gave them a charter, which again mentions their granges and where they would keep their sheep. So clearly from the 13th century onwards, sheep became very important, to the extent that when in 1660s you had to be buried in wool. This was an attempt to ginger up the woolen trade more generally. Dolgellau had a special register at the local church to demonstrate that you had been buried in wool. Previous to that, you were just buried. By being buried in wool, quite expensively, if you didn't arrange to be buried in wool, you had a £5 fine, which was an enormous sum of money in 1666. So this register in detail outlines who's been buried in wool, who paid, and the vicar then signed to say that they had been buried. So wool started to become, in the 17th century, an important commodity. And the wills that Medden's been researching lately demonstrate that actually we've neglected this century. An awful lot of the farmers who died had very large stocks of wool, woolen cloth, and left large amounts of money. So clearly, even by the 17th century, it tends to be the 18th century that the interest starts to emerge. By the 17th century, the Dolgellau woolen industry was by far the most important industry. And then you have, in the 18th century, its flowering. Now this is a really nice drawing of Dolgellau in 1777 by somebody called Hieronymus Grimm, which is a Swiss artist, a lovely name. And you see here, in fact, there's a cockpit here. The first time that Medwin, when he saw this drawing, knew where the cockpit for the Golden Lion Hotel was located. But interestingly enough for the discussion today are the Tenterfield, which he has drawn above here. And Dolgellau must have been encircled with tenter where the wool was dried and stretched. So it's a really interesting drawing from the perspective of giving you an indication of the town. There has been a lot of debate about whether this is washing or whether they are skins being dried, because of course the associated industry with wool was tanning, and again that was a really important industry. So I'd be grateful for any personal comments as whether you think that's the washing drying, or perhaps more likely it is skins that are drying there. So it's a cottage-based industry. It's not an industry in factories. It's not, apart from the fulling mills, an industry using industrial processes. It's based in farms, And in fact, farm servants were employed as much for their skills in spinning or weaving as they were in agricultural labour. So they would spin and weave most of the winter in the dark, cold months, and then of course in the summer they would be employed on the farm in agricultural practice. And they were, as I say, quite wealthy. So there's a will, I think, in around 1791 of John Hull of Bullcheroswen, and he's got 2 looms worth £3. Again, quite a bit of money. In 1791, there is a trade directory, and there are 12 web manufacturers in Dolgellau, by far the greatest number of occupational employment. So 12 people employing other people demonstrates perhaps the size of the industry by then. And Arthur Aitken, who travelled in North Wales, and we are reliant a lot on the observations of hardy travellers who came to Wales when the Napoleonic War stopped them doing their grand tour. And he said that almost every little farmer makes webs, and few cottages in these parts are without a loom. So it's clearly something that gave the local economy a considerable amount of impetus. Right, so what did they make? Well, what they made was called gwe, and this is a rare example, not many left now unfortunately. So this is not flannel, this is not linsey, this is not the more commercial cloth that you see in the 19th century. This was called gwe, in English webs. It was used to woven from all of the wool was not sorted, and it's described as a coarse white cloth. So it was very hardy. It was something that the cloth that was made from it lasted a long time. Now, it was woven on 200 yards of cloth. And I cannot imagine how long it would have taken a weaver to do it, but apparently they were very quick. 200 yards of cloth were woven on a single loom. It was cut into 100 yards for transport and then taken down. So it was a labour-intensive industry, no machines, no power looms, nothing. It was all done on hand looms. So although by the 18th century, of course, you have the spinning jenny, you have Arkwright's water frame, none of that was adopted in Dolgellau. It was purely hand loom, and it was all presumably done by labour. It was sold unfinished. There was very little effort in the 18th century to finish it in Dolgellau, and we'll see in a minute where it ended up. But that is the cloth that was made. And of course, if it was all handmade, these are the hand carders, no carding machines. And these were used by women, by children, to card the wool, to get the wool into a state where it could be spun, to get the fibres going together. All done by machinery, of course, in the 19th century, particularly in England. But in Dolgellau, the hand carder lasted quite a long time. And in fact, we've got the card maker's arms in Dolgellau, which reflects the fact that these wooden carders were all made locally. Then you had the spinning, which again was done in cottages, allegedly all by women and children, although there were quite a few male spinners, you can see in Dolgellau records. This is a 19th century reproduction by John Thomas. He brought these clothes for the local women to wear, so that you see the same clothes in different locations. Here she is with the Dreugplow, the big wheel, the wheel that was generally used for spinning the yarn, which is appearing there. And it took a long time for the spinners to produce enough yarn for the weavers, and that was one of the weaknesses of the cottage industry, in that before you had carding and spinning machines, the weavers just didn't have enough wool to weave, and they would have to buy it in from Livorno in Italy. Lamb's wool was bought and imported into Barnes near Dolgellau. So the lack of wool the lack of spun wool could be an issue. And then, of course, you have the weaver. This is a lovely painting, I think, by Gladys Vasey from Talbot and Ceredigion, of a weaver in Talbot. The hand looms were all made locally from local wood, and you have quite a few carpenters who were, that was their occupation, were making these looms. They were set up in houses. They were also set up in buildings, and I have an example of a couple of buildings where they were used. And the hand loom was never replaced in Dolgellau by power looms. Mainly, I suggest, there weren't many locations you could put them in, but also you couldn't really get the coal to Dolgellau cheaply enough compared to perhaps even Newtown, where you have the canal to bring it in. So it wasn't economically viable to put the power looms in. So the hand looms survived in Dolgellau when they were long gone. And of course the cloth then had to be fulled at the fulling mills, and we will see some examples of those. The fulling mills were mostly located on a couple of rivers, and clearly they came and went, and I'm sure Ian will indicate what the evidence is for how they came and went. But it must have been deafening, and we do have some early observations from travellers saying the click of the shuttle and the pounding of the hammers could be heard in Dolgellau day and night. It was an industrial town. It's very hard to imagine it now for those of you who've been there. A quiet, peaceful, quite a pretty town. But at those times it must have been incredibly noisy, and it was very, very busy and very wealthy. So most of the weavers are assumed to have been men. I think that's probably a fair comment. However, there were quite a few women weavers in Dolgellau. Some of them, I'm sure, were wives of weavers, some were daughters of weavers. But it would be a mistake to say and to characterise it that the women did the spinning, the men did the weaving. The whole family got involved in all the processes, and if that involved weaving, then certainly the women got stuck in. And where did it go? Well, it went here to Shrewsbury, to the market hall in Shrewsbury, where it was traded on the first floor. Now the Shrewsbury Drapers Company very shrewdly got a monopoly of Welsh wool. They were formed in 1462, and from the 15th to the 17th century, they controlled the Welsh woolen trade. Welsh woolen manufacturers had to sell to them, and they had to take the wool that quite long and quite perilous journey, really, from Dolgellau to Shrewsbury in pack trains. They were on pack ponies. This 200 long webs that they had to take with them. And they went above a little bit of chicanery in that the wool was measured on a round drum, and it was measured by the yard. But of course, the bigger the drum, the more that was put on, the more the more cloth that you needed to do a revolution of the drum. So the Welsh always felt very bitterly short-changed, literally, by the Shrewsbury drapers. And one commentator did mention, the Welsh had the labour, the English the profit. I think that's probably a fair summary of the time. The Shrewsbury drapers would finish the wool. They had shearmen in Shrewsbury specifically employed to finish these webs so that they could then be sold on. They were sold on to Blackwell Hall in London, where all the woolen cloth of England and Wales was traded. And it was traded then mostly for export, which is really where most of the output went. Of course, there was some local need for cloth, but most of it went to Blackwell Hall. And it was then exported. Now, the webs, the cloth, was specifically suited for anything that required hard use. That was military uniforms, and there were a lot of European wars in the 18th century, so Dolgellau and Meirionydd woolen cloth was used for uniforms, but the majority of the profit came from clothing slaves, and it was widely bought by slave owners in the Caribbean and in North America. And certainly a lot of these people made a lot of money from it. Not, I hasten to add, a lot of Dalgashire weavers, because of course they had sold it on to Shrewsbury, and most of the profit then came from finishing and selling it. But they were implicated, if you like, in this trade because it was their produce that produced it. But I suspect that a lot of them are more concerned in keeping a wage going for their families, although they must have known ultimately that the cloth was being used for this awful practice. But it was, as I say, that's where much of the profit came for this cloth. It was exported later from Barmouth. When the Shrewsbury drapers lost their monopoly, effectively, you would get factors from Liverpool, from Bristol, coming to Dalgashire to buy the cloth. And it was then exported from Barmouth in large supplies until you had various wars which stopped you taking it, particularly the Napoleonic War, and it had to go back inland again. But even then, it didn't stop the trade because they just charged more for it, taking into account that it costs a lot more to put it overland. But interestingly enough, one of the difficulties of exporting the cloth from Barmouth were pirates, particularly Irish pirates, who would lie offshore in Barmouth waiting for the ships to leave. And they would then ransom the individuals on board and take the cloth and sell it in Europe. And there was one notorious pirate, Luke O'Brien, who had a ship who was incredibly successful at intervening in these voyages. And one poor man was put off in Dieppe. The cabin boy was put off in Cornwall to tell the people in Dalgashire that he had to be ransomed. And this poor cabin boy had to make his way from Cornwall back to Dalgashire by various means, so that the woolen factor could be ransomed from Dieppe, which he was. So it wasn't just European wars. European pirates, Irish pirates were involved. The population of Dalgashire doubled between 1801 and 1821 from 2,000 to 4,000 people. And it really was on the basis of the woolen industry. But of course, by now, the webs were losing their status as the main cloth output. People wanted far better and more sophisticated cloth. So in the 19th century, there was this gradual decline. Also, the American War of Independence, the market for clothing slaves, although it was still there, was clearly a lot less than the 18th century. So you do get this decline and the increase in Dalgashire merchants and web factors now turning to flannel, turning to linsey, turning to poplin, turning to more popular Victorian cloth. Okay, now where in Dalgashire they did this cleaning. This is a really nice photo of Dalgashire as it was, and in some ways I wish it was like that now. Quite picturesque for us, isn't it? But that was done around 1835. However, with the rebuilding of the early 19th century from the profits of the woolen industry, you have these larger houses were built. This is Fordon House, and you can see that the wool was loaded up, the cloth was loaded down, and the upper two stories of Fordon House were where the hand looms were located and the weavers were employed. And you can still, it's one of the few remnants now that you can see. And similarly, in Serre, the old Star Inn, there are stairs there and a bridge where the weavers could go up the stairs, across the bridge, and then they could weave in the top two floors of the inn. So downstairs it was an inn, the top two stories it was a weaving loft. And there are 2 or 3 examples in Dalgashire which fortunately have survived. So in the 19th century we have now moved on to much more, I would imagine, usual fare being exported from Dalgashire. This is the woolen warehouse which was built again, you can see the more local architecture next door, based on the profits of the woolen industry. And this is John Maynard Jones. His name was actually John Jones, but he thought John Maynard Jones sounded posher, so he just added it to his name. And he was very successful. He had a mail order business which rivaled the Price Jones mail order business in Newtown, and would send the cloth mainly for hunting and shooting fraternity. He would send it all over the UK. And we had other similar successful drapers and manufacturers. This is Richard Jones, one of his advertisements around about 1878, I think. And he had the contract for the Very Honest Constabulary, who needed a lot of woolen uniforms, so he did quite well out of that. So you're starting to get a feel now for the 19th century. We become, I think, a little bit more mainstream, having now stopped making webs. We now make shawls, we make hunting cloth, which was very popular and sold well. Now, where were they working? Ian will outline the survey work that's been done, but it was the Afon Aran mostly, and you can see there were factories and fulling mills all along the river. As I say, it must have been a deafening experience to have walked up that. And a few of these, very briefly. This is Brongo at the top of the valley. You can just see the fulling mill there. There was a factory here as well, and that was the cottage where the family lived. The River Arun at this point is starting to have quite a steep decline. There is certainly a purchase there for installing a water wheel to go down. So that was Brongo. You then have what was very picturesquely called Pandy, but it's actually called Pandy Abernethe. A very rickety bridge, you know. They did improve that bridge lately, but I don't fancy walking that bridge very often. But this was very important in the tourism industry, because people would walk up the Arun to see Pandy Abernethe. Can't see the sea much there. You can actually see that the wool and the people are starting to process it there. They lived in the store, above the store on the right-hand side. But that was what the tourists came to see, which is a painting by William Henry Mander of Pandy Abernethe. Slightly different there, but very sharp. And it was very, very much painted. And these are the 5 sons of Pandy Abernethe, of the Roberts families. These are the 5 sons of David Pandy Roberts. And what's interesting about the Roberts family is that they were fullers in Pandy Abernethe from 1788 until 1901. It was one family that stayed at the Pandy until then, and in fact several of them were called Pandy Roberts, and there is a David Pandy still living in Dalgeshire. However, they're also fairly typical in that they're a local family who stayed in the locality. There weren't many people who moved into Dalgeshire. It was mostly local people. Here's another really nice representation of Pandy Abernethe, again by Mander, in true Victorian tradition. The river looks slightly wider than this painting. However, it did attract a lot of tourists, and if you look in the Cardigan Bay Advertiser, walking up the Arun Valley to see the Pandy was one of the things to do. This is Factory Abernethe, the other side of the river, and one of the, as with Abernethe, one of the fulling mills that Ian will talk to you about. And it started life probably in the 18th century. It ended up as a clock factory before it closed down. But for example, in 1881, Evan Williams, he employed a carder, 2 spinners, 2 16-year-old weavers, and 2 14-year-old wool feeders for the carding machine. So you can see in this one, it's big enough to put a machine into it. As opposed to the smaller, older fulling mills, this one now could accommodate the carding machine. Another one on the River Arun, again beautifully displayed by William Lander, is Pandirwenash, which I believe, yes, the survey was completed for Pandirwenash. This is a more realistic representation of Pandirwenash, and it is actually quite a nice photo, early photo of the Pandi, which again, unfortunately, is no longer there. Now, one of the families who lived here was the followers, David Lloyd or David Lloyd, and we are really fortunate, as Ap Henry Lloyd was a printer in Aberdare, I believe. But more importantly, his grandmother, Janet Lloyd, was the wife of David Lloyd, and was his grandmother. And he wrote a little book called Dwy Wraig o'r Wlad, Two Women from the Country, about his two grandmothers. And he talks about his holidays at Pandirwenash and playing in the wool, being thrown in the wool by his relatives. And he talks about the Cathral, the devil, the willowing machine. And it's really good because it's one of the very, very rare examples of first-hand account of a Dolgellau family engaged in the wool industry. So it's a delightful book. And it's really nice to have it. David Lloyd, again, was fairly typical of the type of occupation in that he was from the area. He was an enthusiastic supporter of the local friendly society, Clwb yr Angel, and he was also an elder of the local Methodist chapel. And again, it's this sort of enterprising local enterprise who are also leaders of their local communities. The Dolgellau woolen industry is a really good example of these types of industries and their influence on the development of civil society as well. Now this is a slightly different one. You can see it's a lot bigger, and this was built in 1902. But the original factory on the right was built in 1806 by 4 local businessmen. And it's a slightly different development. This was a business venture to put in spinning and carding machines. And it was bought, John Marriott Jones bought it, and it was then bought when he retired by an entrepreneur from Cardiff, who you may have come across, called Solomon Andrews, who developed Pwllheli and the transport industry in Cardiff, I think. And he built this enormous extension. In fact, you can just about see the yarn drying in the front there. And he demolished Pandirwenash, more or less, to build this enormous extension. None of which survives. So it's a really rare photograph of it. And it represents perhaps in some ways the end of the woolen industry, but also what could have happened had the industry been able to obtain greater investment, that this could have continued. But a major fire destroyed it in the 1930s, and in fact it had turned into a tannery before it closed down. So a variety of circumstances meant that this investment didn't really prosper in the 20th century. And this is Factory Fawr. This was another Pandi and small factory at the lower end of the Arun with this characteristic diamond window, which you had in a lot of Dolgellau houses. And it was an absolute tragedy because this wonderful building was knocked down in the 1980s and a modern hall was built on the site. Neville remembers sitting with his grandfather on that doorstep there. His grandfather was closing the big wool sacks with a big needle, a curved needle, before they were sent to Bradford. So it was used for wool storage until the 1970s. But as I say, it was a tragic loss to Dolgellau, but nothing remains of this lovely building. These are the stepping stones, San Hindelen, which the workers used to cross the River Arun. They all lived in Penrhyn Uchaf, the top of the town, in very crowded little courts and little houses, a lot of them on top of one another. So they had to cross the river to the other factories. And these stepping stones are still there and still used by the local population to get to the other side of the river. And here is Velenicha, which is where they were going. So this is here, is Velenicha. That is one Pandi Isa, one of the Lower Pandis. Again, all of which have now gone. But it's a lovely drawing of about 1850, which shows the mill house and the mill behind. That was a corn and fulling mill. So it was a corn mill and it was a fulling mill. And John Mills was the miller in the 19th century. His actual name is John Miles. I suspect that he was just called John Mills because that's what he did. And his wife, Elizabeth Miles, or Elizabeth Mills, had her factory here. And she's a fantastic example of a Victorian entrepreneur. She allegedly employed around 600 women who were spinning, knitting, and making cloth for her. And she was also very enterprising. And when Queen Victoria came to stay nearby in Corwen in 1889, she sent her a shawl. And apparently Victoria was so taken with this shawl that she allowed her to call all those shawls Victoria shawls, and she did very well at it. And this is her certificate for exhibiting in the 1851 Great Exhibition. So Dolgellau entrepreneurs were there, they were all local, but they did, in fairness to them, do their best in the 19th century to maintain the tradition. We are very fortunate that Emily Gardner took photographs of local mills and Pandau in the 1950s around Dolgellau. And this is one of her photos of Velenicha before it was demolished, and modern houses were built on the site. And the last one, you can just about see, slightly away from the River Arun, was Pandi Nant yr Odin, Pandirodin, which is today. A very picturesque part of Dolgellau with the 19th century cottages. But over here, you can just about see the Pandi, and two people sitting outside. And again, it was an interesting Pandi because they did put carding machines next door in 1802, which was very early for Dolgellau. But unfortunately, when they widened the road in the 1920s and rebuilt the bridge, it was demolished. So we no longer have this really nice example of quite an early, 1592, I think, was the first reference to that Pandi. So it was one of the 16th century Pandi in Dolgellau, of which there are several. Right, now, what has been done lately? Well, Group Arun is a small group of local people who have got together to really try and resurrect interest in the local woollen industry and why it's important for Dolgellau. And we've been working with local schools, we've been working with local community groups to try and raise interest. I say the book is one output, and the map, which is on the square where the main car park is for Dolgellau, and you can follow this trail up to the Arun as the Victorian tourists did, slightly more quietly now, and also some leaflets are going to be distributed shortly. So the group hopes to continue with this work of researching the history of this really important industry, and Medon certainly is carrying on. I have been round every Pandi in Merioneth of the last 2 years. I have the scars to prove it. And it's been a fascinating period to find out what actually has survived. However, I will leave you at this point because part of the work of the group has been to do some surveys. And as the group has absolutely no technical knowledge of this work at all, we've been really, really appreciative of the work of Dr. Ian Brooks on helping us on our way. And he is now going to complete the talk by talking about some of the survey work that's been done on the remains of some of the Pandau, which I'm showing you the historical photos of. That's all from me. Thank you very much for your interest.
Really a bit of fraud. I mean, I was commissioned to help the group to do some of the building recording. So all of the hard work, all of the research has all been done by Mervyn and other members of the group. So I come along and I bring along my equipment, stand there and say, no, don't point that, don't press that button, press that one. So we've done a range of things. That's all.
It's the bottom button is forward.
Right, okay. Yeah, so this is various members of the group doing some of the survey work. We've done a range of both topographic survey and photographic survey of the remains of a number of buildings now. Sometimes it involves getting their feet wet, and the river was just low enough that a pair of wellies was going to be sufficient at that time. But other times it's scrambling amongst the slot. One of the big problems of the sites along the Arun is that it's a wooded valley, so recording is a challenge, shall we say, particularly as the group doesn't seem to be particularly keen on working in the middle of winter when we get a better view. Anyway, so this is the area we're interested in, and we've been working on this little area just south of Llangefni, really from about here and then round to here, which, if we then look at the larger scale map, the red stars are the buildings we've done detailed recording of. In fact, that's just slightly misplaced, that should be in there. The two yellow stars are sites we've managed to get a quick photograph of but not done any detailed recording. The black star is a house, part of a farm that was originally part of the Nanai estate. Just by chance I had a commercial job to record that, but there is a link between this house or potential link between the house and the mill. So then if we look at the LiDAR, you get an idea of how difficult putting a building on this valley is. It's quite a steep, deep valley, so finding a platform on which to actually put any sort of building, particularly a mill, is difficult. There's a bit of space at that end. This end, it's very deep, but the Idris factory here, which was that one with the big range that Linda's just shown us, is occupying the one relatively flat area, which is how they could develop a big area. So we'll start at the far end. And so the topographic survey we carried out, which shows quite a complex of material of buildings here, and it looks like this main range here developed effectively downslope. We've got an original building here which has a chimney in it and presumably was the house, and then we've got two unheated extensions, the last one of which has a wheel pit alongside it and a hole for the shaft to go through. Now this is very unusual for the buildings that we've got along the Arun, in that this actually has a mill, or had a mill pond. It's a rather nasty damp patch at the moment, with a potential intake off to one corner. The mill pond came right up to the end of the house there. There were two, surprisingly, take-off leats. There is the main leat, which comes here alongside the building, over these two launder supports to the wheel pit, and then with a tail race coming back to the river. But there was also a small leak which ran along the front of the building and then fed into here. And I can only assume that this was to provide water for washing and during the hammering of the cloth. inevitably these buildings are not just being used for the pandy and the associated works. We've got a pigsty in here and what was probably the garden and a little set of steps up. There's a modern track in, but on here on the side of the slope there's a very slight lynching across the hillside. I wonder whether or not that might not be where the tenders were for this building. Now, as I said, it was rather wooded in there. You can see spot a building. It is there, it's in here. This is the track originally into the building, and the building is hidden in amongst that. And then we've got the mill pond off to one side there. So recording photographing it was a challenge. You get in a bit closer, and there it is. That's the gable end of the house, and this is the trackway in, track running along the side of the front of the building there. And then if you get a bit closer, this is once again the gable end of that house. Very curiously, we've got a single hole in the roof, in the face of the building there. Not quite sure what it was holding. They're not equivalent, so it's not a set of rafters running across. There's some sort of structure within the house which is other than that. Also, there's a blocked window in it as well. So then this is the hole where the shaft from the water wheel came through into the building. This is inside the building. And then, yes, outside the building, there it is here, a little bit of metal still attached to the building there. And then the launder from the pond, well, the mill pond would have come across here and then fed over the wheel. There we go. We've got this one bit of metalwork surviving on the outside. Presumably this is to do with controlling the water supply. Some sort of lever on various positions marked, but that is effectively the only bit of machinery, if you want to put it that way, that survives. Yeah, so we've got two. These are the launder supports, which were really substantial. You see there, what, 1.5 meters high. So the launder itself would have gone over the top and then onto the mill. This is the access track in. Garden is just off there. But you can see the problem we had. Real fun getting photographs of this. So this is the 1902, which gives you a better idea. There we've got the mill pond. In 1902, the house is now roofless, but the rest of the building is still operating with its access routing, various things, and that pigsty is in here. Now that's obviously showing the decline of Wenath, a factory. But I would say I'm very lucky. I literally, in the last 3 months, I've been commissioned to record this building. This is Plassen Brithdeer, which is just up above the Wenath site. Now, in its current state, it's a 18th century done up part of the Nanai estate. One of the people who ran the Nanai estate had a fascination with architecture, and he did up a whole load of the local farms. That's the one. but he refused to use a proper architect. So you get these buildings where he's obviously gone through a book and said, fancy one of those and one of those, and they've slapped it onto these buildings. So this thing has got this round porch tacked on the front, and then these over-decorated chimneys stuck up. And building is listed, and it's listed as an example of the Nanai estate. However, when you go and look inside it, you've got a cruck frame. In fact, you've got 3 cruck frames. And the earliest reference we've got to this building is in 1586, when the ownership was transferred, along with 2 mills. And one wonders whether or not one of those mills was the Wenouth mill that we've looked at. And if you think about it, we've got, in the same area, there is a second mill just up from Wenouth, and it may be the 2 that are part of it. So our Wenouth may have started life quite early in the 16th century, but it continues on, say by 1902 it's beginning to decline. We then, second season, we moved up to this little group, the Pandy Adonite that Linda showed us, and its factory up here, the remains of the Idris factory here, and another strange little building here, which might just be Pandy Stookley, but the amount that survives here is very little. So, once again, the same problem. It's quite a wooded, steep valley, but here they've put in quite a substantial weir. Let's get our survey up. So we've got this substantial weir here, which is something like 3.5 metres high, from which water would have run through a rock cut leat here, and then along a wooden maunder to the wheel pit in front. Wheeling here, and then there's a couple of phases of buildings on this very high platform. This has obviously been added on at a later stage. The main factory would have been here. And then the Pandy site, what we've got is the wheel pit surviving and 2 sides of the building. That is then subsumed into the bank for the platform for the Idris factory. And opposite it, we've got, presumably it was a store, it's a building with quite a wide doorway here, but no obvious signs of wheels or anything associated with it. So, there's the dam, substantial piece of work. I would suspect that there was originally a natural rock barrier across there, which they've heavily improved. And in fact, this dam has at least 2 phases of construction. You can see the difference between the big stones, rounded stones, which has happened, and then this side is largely concrete. So either they've had a big collapse or someone's decided to improve the dam. From there it runs through this, believe me, there is a rock cut channel that is running across it, so it runs in here. There's just a little ridge of rock left on between this and the river itself. In fact, you see the guy who was moving the raiding rods is just hiding around the corner there. And then it ran onto this large revetted platform, and you see the buttresses that was needed in order to do that, and then the factory itself was built on top of that platform with what presumably a wooden launder running on this shelf to the wheel pit. There we go. This is the side of the wheel pit. There's the platform in the background. The remains of it here. It's collapsed at this end, and it then looks like that when you look down it. So it's going to be what, 2 meters 20 or so deep that we can measure. I'm not quite sure what's happening down here. And we've got the one piece that actually shows us that this is a wheel pit. And we've got the bearing for the wheel. Now this is on the mill side, so presumably the power takeoff must have been on some sort of geared wheel somewhere on the wheel itself. It's the only hint we've got of the mechanism supplies, unfortunately. So yeah, so there we are. This is the little building on the end of the platform, still surviving to about 2 meters, whereas the rest of the building is down sort of about a metre or so. We give the group the merit. They worked hard when they were recording this. Particularly the people doing the photography, climbing in and out of this building, because of course access is actually across the river, so getting in there is always a bit tricky. So we've got some images of what this factory might have looked like. There's the Alfred Quinton image of 1902, with quite a large wheel on this one, which is what the field evidence seems to suggest it is true, although the photograph shows it as an overshot wheel.
I think the painting is Wenash wheel, and that's on the 9th. So that painting is Wenash.
Is it?
It's on the right hand side, looking down from Passenger.
Is it? It didn't.
Yeah. Whereas Patch Over 90 is on the left hand side, further down the valley.
Yeah.
I think so. That might explain. There is a front
Well, you
wheel.
see, you've got what looks like the pandy
That's
there,
Patch,
and
that would be Patch Over
Yeah,
on the
yeah.
left hand side. And then further
Yeah.
down you've got Patch Over 90.
anyway,
Yeah,
let's go for the photograph anyway.
Okay.
Shows it as an overshot wheel, which means that the wheel is a lot smaller than I would have expected. Also, there is here the remains we've got. The outer side of the wheel pit, the wall of it, seems to would have been a lot higher. The pivot point actually was down below the top of that wall. So, but there's something that obviously there are different phases on this site. This is one phase, and the final phase must have been slightly different. So that's that one. And then if we look at the 2 Ordnance Survey maps, we've got, there's our winner, the one further up the river, with its sluice and its pond. The Placid Drift there is just off this. And then we've got in 1888, so it's survey 1887, our range of buildings along here. There's the Pandy will just come on to. There's the factory. At that stage, the Ordnance Survey calls it the Upper 9th factory. And then this is the Idris, which is the factory that developed with that long range. In fact, long range here, which takes over the end of the Pandy. there. So I also noticed, 1954, that's completely gone. But these are still roofed structures. This is the remains of the pandy. Difficult with it, but this is the outer side of the wheel pit, and we can just about see, or we'll see it better. There we go. There is the hole in the wall for the shaft to run through, and then next door to it is this separate building, slightly better bridge these days. Next door to it, which is standing to about 3 metres in one corner, but it's virtually gone at the other end. So, a couple of images that, curious. I mean, you were saying about it being a tourist. That is a Great Western Railway postcard. So, it just shows you how important to the tourist industry that the Great Western Railway thought it important enough to produce a postcard. And then, but these shows the arrangement. Once again, the outer side of the wheel pit doesn't appear to be very clear. It's certainly there. It's the bit you notice these days. And then the two sites that we couldn't get into. This is what remains of the Idris factory. We couldn't actually get into this. This is in a locked compound, very big padlocks on the gate. But if you go along the footpath along the side, you can just about see it. And you can get some idea that it's a multi-phase survival. We've got a stonework base to it and then a brick replacement. I believe it had a fire at one stage. No.
Yes, there were two fires, one in 1921 and one in 1933, I think, and one it was a tannery, presumably a lot of inflammable stuff, and after the second fire, I think it was abandoned.
Yeah, so I suspect that the brickwork is a replacement for this building. If you walk further up the footpath, you can just about get the inlet lead showing, and it runs towards the end of that building we've just seen. And I think we actually jumped over the fence and didn't get that one. It's not quite right. And then there's this thing. This is a little fragment of building which might just be Pandy Stookley. The first edition Ordnance Survey map shows a building here, and it shows what it claims to be stepping stones further up the little tributary stream. And you can see here this has a very clear leat hole underneath this face. So I suspect that is all that survives of Pandy Stookley. But we do have further up that little street this little arrangement here. On the Ordnance Survey maps it's shown as stepping stones. I just wonder whether it's not actually a set of a very small rough dam. It's very clear that the amount of water coming down there is not great, and presumably this building went out of use very quickly and was replaced by much more of the investment for the factory overnight and other things on the main river.
And the name Stookley is really interesting. Stookley is a village in Huntingdonshire, and very long way from Dolgellau, but it's still called Ceylan Stookley today, as the quite rightly says, and perhaps there was a pandy there. And in fact there was a Moses Stookley Evans found who was buried nearby in 1680, and there was certainly a Stookley panner Stookie Fuller, working in Nanai in 1720. So it could have been a family that moved, or were moved to Dolgellau as experienced Fullers perhaps, to show others, how to do it. But they certainly stuck around. Kayland Stookie is still called today. So it would be a fascinating example if you could find out whether that was
Yeah.
the pulling mill where the Stookies worked.
Yeah, I mean, the thing for me is that this is a true community archaeology project. It's not me as a professional saying, this is what I want done, can you come and help me? This is a group of interested people who have done all the research themselves, but have then decided that they need a little bit more help and then have asked for the professional help. So the group is in the driving seat. It's up to them what gets done. I'm there just to provide a little bit of technical support, really.
What invaluable expertise.
Okay, right. Thank you. Yeah, that's it. Thank you.